What is cognitive bias? A cognitive bias is a strong, preconceived notion of someone or something based on information we have, perceive to have, or lack. These preconceptions are mental shortcuts that the human brain produces to expedite information processing, to quickly help it make sense of what it's seeing. The many types of cognitive biases serve as systematic errors in a person's subjective way of thinking, which originate from that individual's own perceptions, observations, or points of view. There are different types of bias people experience that influence and affect the way we think and behave, as well as our decision-making process. ESTPs and ESFPs. The Dunning-Kruger effect. ESTPs and ESFPs believe that life is best approached confidently, directly, and with force. As a result, they might fall into the Dunning-Kruger effect bias of overestimating their abilities in certain areas. A little knowledge can indeed be dangerous, but these types know that a little knowledge plus a lot of action beats passive expertise every time. There's method in the madness. More than this, there are different types of knowing. Theoretical or book knowledge, whilst being essential, often gets reimagined and reconsidered when it smashes up against the concrete realities and the practical problems of implementation. The bird's eye view strategy looks very different when you're on the ground level. As a result, they often think, why not go straight to the ground level and skip the theory that might turn out to be wrong anyway? Sometimes their overconfidence can catch them out when they jump into things too quickly. ISTJs and ISFJs. Anchoring bias and availability bias. Anchoring bias describes the tendency to find certain things acceptable or normal based on how they relate to a particular reference or anchoring point. Essentially, it's a bias to whatever the established norm is, whether that's on a small scale, such as the initial price you hear for an item, or a much larger scale, such as a societal norm. If you give ISTJs and ISFJs time, space, and a level of certainty, they'll outcompete pretty much everyone else. I've often described them as great maintainers, but perhaps an underrated trait of theirs is their ability to be great builders too. There is a danger that because of this ability, they get too attached to the norm or the way things are, even if those things ought to be different. Availability bias refers to the tendency to use the information we can quickly recall when evaluating a topic or idea, even if this information is not the best representation of the topic or idea. Using this mental shortcut, we deem the information we can most easily recall as valid and ignore alternative solutions or opinions. ISFJs and ISTJs put great stock in their experience. It's one of the things they trust the most, perhaps more than anything else. This gives them the ability to learn the lessons of their past, something which is an astonishingly rare trait. Overvaluing this, though, can negate new and potentially better information. INFJs and INTJs. Clustering illusion. Both of these types are pattern-finding machines, although the areas they turn that skill to might differ. Sometimes an elegant narrative that connects disparate data points together is very seductive, since it offers the promise of a eureka moment. The clustering illusion bias describes the tendency of people to find connections where there aren't any, or to be more specific, to create connections that could make sense, but ultimately don't when you have sufficient data. Reading between the lines is a huge strength of these types. Spotting patterns that other people miss is one of the greatest gifts they can give, but like with all strengths, it can spill over into being a weakness at times. ENFJs and ESFJs. Fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error refers to an individual's tendency to attribute another's actions to their character or personality, while attributing their own behavior to external situational factors outside of their control. When you are a people person and have a huge amount of connections and relationships, you get to see all the various archetypes of people out there in the world. You see all different types of people. As a result, when someone displays a behavior, it might be tempting to reflexively say, oh, they are that kind of person, as an explanation for that behavior, when in reality, it might be because of circumstances out of their control, and not a reflection of them. In my experience, these types are more than willing to assess their own character in a detached and objective way, but this is certainly a cognitive bias that they are susceptible to, based on their type. ENTPs and ENFPs. Fear of missing out and reactance. Yes, FOMO is actually a cognitive bias. Chronic victims of the grass is greener syndrome, further intensified by the fact that, for them, the grass really is greener when they switch to something new. It just becomes less fun when you need to start mowing the lawn. These types are not completely slaves to their intellectual passions and curiosity. They can hunker down and commit when needed, but boredom is an eternal spectre that haunts them in life, and few things make them disappear or run away faster. Reactance describes the tendency to do the opposite of what someone wants you to do. It's contrarianism. ENTPs and ENFPs both reactively and intentionally do this, often for no other reason than to prove a point. Perhaps ironically, a good way to get them to commit to something is to tell them they can't do it, counteracting their FOMO with some reactance. ENTJs and ESTJs. Self-serving bias. The self-serving bias describes when we attribute positive events and successes to our own character or actions, but blame negative results on external factors unrelated to our character. Both ENTJs and ESTJs are big and strong-willed personalities and are driven to achieve in various ways. They will more often than not extol and live out a philosophy of personal responsibility and individual agency. They have a low tolerance for people who aren't trying and taking action to improve themselves and their lives. When this goes overboard, it can be difficult for them to attribute failure to mistakes they've made versus external factors influencing events. In essence, they believe strongly in being the captains of their fate, to the point where anytime they don't steer their ship to its destination, they might feel it was more dependent on choppy waters than their own steering. INFPs and ISFPs. Decision fatigue and choice overload. Decision fatigue describes the draining effect of having to make lots of choices in succession. The quality of our choices degrades pretty rapidly under these circumstances, to the point where we often simply avoid them altogether, falling into complete indecisiveness. In the modern age, we have an abundance of choices, which on the face of it is a good thing, but as we know, in practice, it rarely works out that way. Traversing oceans of choices, many of which involve picking between equally undesirable options for INFPs and ISFPs, can at times be quite brutal. This can unfortunately result in them being passive, or alternatively, reacting intensely and forcefully and making choices that line up more with their values, but involve making pretty extreme changes that catch people off guard in their life. ISTPs and INTPs. The curse of knowledge. The curse of knowledge is a cognitive bias that occurs when an individual who is communicating with other individuals assumes they have the background knowledge to understand. This bias is also called by some authors the curse of expertise. Sometimes when you are knowledgeable in a certain area, it's easy to forget that other people aren't, or even more, that other people don't even care about learning much about a specific topic. It's hard to both remember and empathize for that state of not knowing something. Consequently, ISTPs and INTPs might not give people enough time to catch up with their logic, which took a long time to build. So there's a tendency to see other people as being, intellectually lacking. Sometimes both of these types discount the extent to which their logic is built on layers and foundations of thinking, so it can be difficult for other people to keep up. And that is a reflection of the ISTP or INTP's depth of thinking, rather than the other person's shallowness of thinking. If you enjoy seeing my own personal cognitive biases in action, then please like and subscribe. It makes a big difference to the individual videos and the channel overall. Also check out all of the links below, including my individual social media and our Discord server.